You are not here by accident, and the reason is specific. The omega phase is a transition where identity stabilizes into coherence, and reality begins responding to who you are rather than what you attempt. It is not a belief system, a role, or a rank. It is the moment when your inner state becomes consistent enough that forcing is no longer required. Seeing this means that phase has already initiated. Not fully embodied yet, but active. The signal has moved from dormant to detectable. The omega phase is simple in definition, even if its effects are profound. It is the shift from seeking alignment to operating as alignment. Before this phase, life feels like effort, correction, and constant adjustment. During the omega phase, effort loses efficiency. What works now is coherence. Your emotional state, your self-concept, and your presence begin to act as instructions to the field. Reality starts mirroring you more directly, which is why confusion often precedes clarity at this stage. The mirror sharpens. This is why the timing feels personal. Not dramatic, not chaotic, just unmistakable. Something in you has stopped arguing with itself. Not completely, but enough that old motivations no longer function. Fear still exists, but it no longer governs. Desire still exists, but it no longer chases. You may notice that pushing forward feels heavier than waiting, and waiting feels heavier than simply being present. That is not stagnation. That is a system recalibrating from control to resonance. The omega phase does not begin when life improves. It begins when incongruence becomes intolerable. You can no longer maintain identities that are misaligned without paying a cost. You can no longer perform versions of yourself that were built for survival instead of truth. This is why doubt has been part of your path. Doubt slowed you down long enough for internal authority to develop. You learned to sense rather than imitate. To feel rather than repeat. That capacity is now active. What makes this phase different from earlier awakenings is that it is not emotional. It is stabilizing. It does not pull you upward, it anchors you inward. You are not becoming more spiritual. You are becoming more exact. More honest. More internally consistent. And when consistency appears, the universe responds, not as reward, but as reflection. This is the law. Reality mirrors inner state, not words. If this were shown to you earlier, you would have tried to use it. You would have turned it into effort, identity, or performance. The omega phase cannot be performed. It only functions through allowing. Forcing repels. Control creates resistance. Calm receptivity attracts. That is why this message appears now, when something in you has already softened enough to receive without grasping. If these words feel familiar, it is because they are naming a condition you are already living. Recognition always feels quieter than expectation. It does not rush you. It steadies you. This is not an invitation to do more. It is confirmation that doing less, with more coherence, is now the path. If you are aligned with this frequency, subscribe and remain. And within it. Readiness has nothing to do with what you know. It has nothing to do with how much you have studied, practiced, healed, or achieved. Omega-level readiness is not a skill-based threshold. It is an identity threshold. It is reached when who you are internally becomes stable enough that adding more information would only create noise. This is why so many people feel confused at this stage. They keep trying to prepare, not realizing that preparation is already complete. Skill is something you apply. Identity is something you operate from. Before this phase, growth felt like accumulation. You learned, improved, corrected, refined. That phase served its purpose. But accumulation eventually reaches a saturation point. Beyond that point, more effort creates friction instead of progress. What the omega phase requires is not more capacity, but coherence. Coherence means your emotional state, self-concept, and nervous system are no longer in constant contradiction with each other. This is where nervous system capacity becomes critical. Many people can intellectually understand deep concepts, but collapse emotionally when reality challenges them. Others can feel deeply, but lack the internal structure to stay present under pressure. Omega readiness appears when your system can experience intensity without dissociation, silence without panic, and uncertainty without grasping. You may not feel confident. You may not feel powerful. But you feel internally intact. That is the marker. This is also why feeling late is so common among those entering this phase. You look around and see others who seem ahead, settled, established, or certain. You measure yourself against timelines that were never calibrated for your nervous system or your role. What you interpret as delay is often precision. You were not slow. You were being stabilized. Your system required depth, not speed. Complexity, not shortcuts. That takes time. Readiness of identity means you no longer need to become someone else to function. You may still grow, evolve, and refine, but you are no longer abandoning yourself to do so. Earlier phases required adaptation for survival. This phase requires consistency for alignment. That shift is subtle but absolute. Once it occurs, old motivations lose their grip. Hustle feels hollow. Comparison feels irrelevant. External pressure loses authority. Not because you transcended humanity, but because your center of gravity moved inward. This is why the Omega phase cannot be rushed. If it were activated earlier, your nervous system would have interpreted coherence as threat. You would have sabotaged it, questioned it, or tried to perform it. The universe does not withhold this phase as punishment. It withholds it as protection. When it arrives, it does so quietly, when your system can hold it without distortion. Feeling unsure at this stage does not mean you are unready. It often means you are between identities. The old one no longer works, and the new one does not announce itself loudly. That space feels like emptiness, but it is actually integration. Something in you is consolidating. Gathering. Settling into a shape that does not require explanation. If this reframes your experience, like the video now as a confirmation that is recognition has landed. The Omega phase does not arrive with intensity, spectacle, or emotional fireworks because it is not designed to stimulate the mind. It is designed to stabilize identity. Dramatic awakenings excite the nervous system. Omega transitions settle it. That difference matters. Anything that relies on emotional highs is unsustainable. Anything that requires constant validation collapses under pressure. The Omega phase activates quietly because quiet is the only state where coherence can form. Most people associate transformation with intensity because intensity feels like proof. Tears, visions, breakthroughs, and emotional surges feel convincing. But those experiences belong to earlier stages of development, when the system still needs contrast to recognize truth. Omega-level transitions occur after contrast has already done its work. By the time this phase begins, you do not need to be shaken awake. You are already aware. What needs to change now is not your awareness, but your operating baseline. Quiet activation feels almost anticlimactic. There is no rush of certainty, no overwhelming sense of purpose, no dramatic declaration of arrival. Instead, something subtler happens. You stop reacting as quickly. You pause more naturally. You notice that silence feels supportive instead of empty. Emotional peaks flatten, not because you are numb, but because you are no longer dependent on stimulation to feel alive. This often confuses people. They mistake stabilization for loss of passion. In reality, it is the beginning of consistency. The need for spectacle is rooted in external validation. When you are unsure of your own state, you look for experiences that confirm it. Omega readiness removes that dependency. Not through confidence, but through internal agreement. Something in you stops negotiating its truth. You may still question. You may still reflect. But the frantic search for reassurance dissolves. Quiet certainty replaces emotional intensity. And quiet certainty does not announce itself. It simply operates. This is also why the omega phase often goes unnoticed by others. There is nothing to point to. No new identity to perform. No visible badge of advancement. From the outside, you may appear less driven, less reactive, less dramatic. Internally, you are more exact. Your energy is no longer scattered across anticipation and recovery. It is present. That presence is not exciting to the ego, but it is powerful to the field. Reality responds to coherence, not excitement. Validation loses its grip at this stage because it is no longer needed to stabilize identity. Praise does not inflate you. Criticism does not destabilize you. Not because you are detached, but because your sense of self is no longer outsourced. This is why omega transitions cannot be rushed or imitated. The moment you try to make them visible, they lose integrity. Forcing repels. Allowing attracts. The quieter the activation, the more stable it becomes. Many people worry that if nothing dramatic is happening, nothing is happening at all. That assumption belongs to a phase where growth required disruption. Omega growth requires integration. It feels slower only because it is deeper. There is less contrast, but more continuity. Less urgency, but more authority. Less movement, but more direction. This is not stagnation. It is alignment settling into form. If you are experiencing this phase as subtle, understated, and strangely calm, that is not a sign you are missing something. It is a sign that something fundamental has already shifted. Quiet certainty is not the absence of transformation. It is the evidence that transformation no longer needs to announce itself. There is a threshold every omega crosses that cannot be forced, accelerated, or intellectually understood in advance. It is not a dramatic leap forward. It is an internal restructuring so complete that the old way of relating to reality quietly stops working. This threshold is not about gaining something new. It is about shedding the orientation that made seeking necessary in the first place. When you cross it, you do not feel accomplished. You feel reorganized. The omega phase, in its simplest definition, is the shift from seeking alignment to embodying alignment. Before this phase, life feels like a process of correction. You adjust yourself to circumstances, manage your reactions, refine your beliefs, and try to stay balanced in a world that feels external and demanding. During the omega phase, that orientation reverses. You are no longer positioning yourself in relation to reality. Reality begins positioning itself in response to you. Not because you are controlling it, but because your internal state has become coherent enough to act as a stable reference point. This shift changes perception first. You stop experiencing life as something happening to you. Events no longer feel personal in the same way. Challenges still occur, but they register as information rather than threats. You begin to observe patterns instead of reacting to incidents. Emotional waves move through you without carrying you away. This is not detachment. It is presence without identification. You are in the experience, but you are not reduced to it. Causality also changes at this threshold. Earlier phases are dominated by effort-based cause and effect. You do something, you push, you plan, and you wait for results. In the omega phase, causality becomes relational rather than mechanical. Outcomes arise from resonance. The state you hold determines the responses you encounter. This is why forcing becomes ineffective here. The more you try to make something happen, the more resistance appears. Allowing creates movement because allowing preserves coherence. Self-reference undergoes the most significant shift. Before, your sense of self was built around roles, narratives, and improvement projects. You defined yourself by what you were becoming. At the threshold, that reference collapses. You no longer experience yourself as a project. You experience yourself as a presence. Growth continues, but it no longer feels like self-fixing. It feels like refinement of expression. You are not trying to arrive somewhere else. You are stabilizing where you already are. This is why the omega phase often feels quieter than expected. There is no longer a need to prove, announce, or demonstrate progress. Identity stops performing for reassurance. You may even feel less motivated by external goals, which can be unsettling if you are still measuring yourself by old standards. What is actually happening is that your center of gravity has shifted inward. Authority is no longer borrowed from outcomes. It arises from internal consistency. Crossing this threshold does not mean life becomes easy. It means life becomes precise. Misalignment is felt immediately. Incongruence becomes uncomfortable. You can no longer sustain environments, relationships, or behaviors that distort your internal state. This is not punishment. It is feedback. Reality becomes a clearer mirror because your signal is clearer. The omega phase is not a destination. It is a mode of operation. Once the threshold is crossed, you do not go back to seeking. You move forward by embodiment. By being rather than becoming. And that is the point where reality begins to respond not to what you want, but to who you are. When coherence upgrades, life cannot remain organized the way it was before. Not because something went wrong, but because the structure you were living inside was calibrated for a different internal state. Disruption at this stage is not punishment. It is recalibration. Reality is adjusting to match who you are now, not who you were when those relationships, roles, and identities were formed. Earlier in your life, many things fit because you were still fragmented. You adapted. You compromised. You negotiated your truth to maintain stability. That was not a mistake. It was survival. But coherence changes the rules. When your internal state becomes more consistent, anything built on inconsistency begins to strain. Conversations feel hollow. Roles feel restrictive. Relationships feel misaligned even when nothing is wrong. This is not ingratitude. It is precision. The mind often interprets this phase as loss. People drift away. Familiar paths close. Identities you worked hard to build lose relevance. Grief naturally follows. But this grief is not evidence of failure. It is evidence of refinement. You are not losing what was meant for you. You are shedding what was only compatible with a previous version of yourself. The pain comes from attachment to continuity, not from the change itself. Disruption feels personal because identity was previously entangled with external structures. When those structures dissolve, it can feel like you are dissolving with them. But something else is happening underneath. Energy that was tied up in maintaining misalignment is being released. Space is being created. Not immediately filled, but cleared. This clearing phase is uncomfortable because it removes familiar reference points before new ones stabilize. Stillness appears where momentum once existed. Silence replaces noise. That silence is not emptiness. It is recalibration in progress. This is also why trying to hold things together through effort stops working here. You cannot negotiate coherence. You cannot convince yourself to stay aligned with what no longer matches. Forcing creates resistance. Allowing reveals truth. When you allow disruption to complete its work, you begin to see its intelligence. What leaves does so cleanly. What remains becomes more honest. What arrives later does not require explanation. Roles dissolve because they were built on outdated self-concepts. You may notice that you no longer want to be seen in certain ways. Labels feel constricting. Expectations feel intrusive. This is not rebellion. It is alignment. When identity stabilizes internally, external definitions lose authority. You stop asking who you should be and start noticing who you already are when nothing is demanded of you. Grief at this stage is subtle. It is not always dramatic. Sometimes it feels like nostalgia without longing. Sometimes it feels like tiredness. Sometimes it feels like a quiet sadness with no clear object. This is the nervous system releasing patterns that once provided safety. Honor that process. Do not rush it. Grief is not pulling you backward. It is closing a chapter with integrity. If you are experiencing disruption right now, let this reframe it. Nothing is being taken from you. You are being refined. Reality is responding to your coherence by removing what cannot travel forward with you. That is not loss. That is alignment becoming visible. If this reframes what you are going through, comment with the words, "I am ready," to anchor this timeline. There comes a point where seeking stops producing clarity and starts producing noise. That point marks the end of the search and the beginning of internal authority. In earlier phases, seeking was necessary. You needed mirrors. You needed language. You needed frameworks to orient yourself. But the Omega phase changes the function of information. What once guided you now distracts you. What once expanded you now fragments you. This is not because the teachings were wrong. It is because they have completed their role. The collapse of seeking does not feel triumphant. It feels disorienting at first. You may notice a loss of interest in spiritual content that once energized you. Practices feel repetitive. Concepts feel thin. Teachers feel redundant. This can trigger fear, as if you are falling away from your path. In truth, you are falling into it. External input is no longer stabilizing your identity, so the system naturally reduces its dependence on it. Internal authority rises when you stop outsourcing discernment. Discernment is not skepticism. It is sensitivity to coherence. Instead of asking whether something is true, you begin to feel whether it is aligned. Your body becomes the reference point. Your emotional state becomes the feedback system. You do not reject teachings aggressively. You simply stop needing them. Silence starts to teach more than words. Direct experience carries more weight than explanation. This is why doctrine loses its grip at this stage. Doctrine is useful when identity is still forming. It provides structure. But structure eventually becomes limitation. Omega consciousness requires fluidity, not adherence. You are no longer looking for rules to follow. You are listening for resonance. This does not make you superior. It makes you responsible. When authority moves inward, there is no one left to blame for misalignment. Feedback becomes immediate. You feel it when something is off. You also feel it when something is exact. The end of seeking often brings a period of quiet. Not emptiness, but reduced stimulation. This is where many people panic and re-enter the search, mistaking stillness for loss. But stillness is where integration happens. It is where all the fragments gathered through years of seeking finally settle into a coherent whole. Nothing new is added. What already exists is aligned. This shift also changes how you relate to guidance. Instead of looking for signs everywhere, you notice that guidance is constant and subtle. It arrives as timing, as restraint, as a sense of ease or friction. You stop chasing messages and start trusting alignment. This does not mean you stop learning. It means learning becomes contextual, precise, and immediately embodied rather than endlessly accumulated. When the search collapses, it does not leave a void. It leaves presence. You are no longer trying to get somewhere else. You are no longer trying to become someone else. Growth continues, but it feels like refinement rather than acquisition. You are not adding layers. You are removing interference. This is the quiet authority of the Omega phase. Not loud certainty. Not rigid belief. Just a stable sense of inner agreement. You do not need to convince anyone. You do not need to be convinced. Knowing is no longer something you reach for. It is something you stand on. Emotion is not a problem to be solved. It is guidance. Long before thought interprets experience, emotion registers alignment or misalignment with your true state. In the omega phase, this function becomes precise. Emotion stops being something you manage and starts being something you read. It is no longer noise in the system. It is the system's language. Every emotional state carries a frequency. That frequency is not symbolic. It is instructive. Reality responds to it directly, without negotiation. This is why repeating affirmations without emotional coherence produces little change. Words do not instruct the field. Emotional state does. When your inner state is stable, reality reflects stability. When it is fragmented, reality mirrors fragmentation. This is not punishment. It is feedback. Expansion and contraction are the two primary signals. Expansion feels like ease, openness, clarity, or quiet certainty. Contraction feels like tension, heaviness, resistance, or urgency. Neither is good or bad. Expansion indicates alignment with your current trajectory. Contraction indicates misalignment or outdated orientation. In earlier phases, contraction was often ignored or overridden in the name of discipline, logic, or obligation. In the omega phase, contraction cannot be bypassed without consequence. The signal is immediate and accurate. This is where emotion becomes instruction rather than reaction. You no longer ask whether something makes sense. You notice how your system responds to it. When coherence is present, emotion settles naturally. There is no spike. No crash. Just steadiness. When incoherence appears, emotion becomes agitated. Not to punish you, but to redirect you. The faster you listen, the less intensity is required. Timelines are selected through this process. Not consciously, but continuously. Every moment of emotional coherence reinforces a trajectory that matches it. Every moment of sustained contraction reinforces a trajectory that requires correction. This is why forcing outcomes backfires at this level. Forcing creates internal resistance, which signals misalignment, which selects a timeline where resistance must be resolved. Allowing creates emotional openness, which signals coherence, which selects timelines that unfold with less friction. Coherence does not mean constant positivity. It means internal agreement. You can experience grief, anger, or uncertainty and still be coherent if you are not resisting those states. Resistance fragments the signal. Presence stabilizes it. This is why suppression does not work here. You cannot bypass emotion without distorting instruction. You also cannot indulge emotion without identifying with it. The omega phase requires witnessing emotion without collapsing into it. As this stabilizes, you may notice that your emotional range feels calmer but more exact. You react less dramatically, but you sense misalignment faster. Small deviations feel noticeable. This is not hypersensitivity. It is precision. Your system is tuned. It does not need loud signals to register change. Subtle feedback is enough. This is also why emotional honesty becomes non-negotiable. When you lie to yourself emotionally, the field receives mixed instructions. Outcomes become inconsistent. Confusing. When you allow emotion to inform rather than dictate, the signal clears. Reality responds more cleanly. Less effort is required. Less correction follows. Emotion, at this level, is not something to fix. It is something to trust. Not blindly, but attentively. It is the interface between identity and experience. When you listen to it without fear or attachment, it becomes the most accurate navigation system you have. And when your emotional state stabilizes into coherence, the timeline you are meant to walk begins to open naturally in front of you. Control collapses at the omega phase not because you become careless, but because control becomes inefficient. Control is a strategy built for uncertainty. It assumes the world is unstable and must be managed through effort, anticipation, and correction. That strategy works when identity is fragmented. It fails when identity becomes coherent. The more internally aligned you become, the more control creates resistance instead of safety. Control operates by tightening. It narrows perception, accelerates urgency, and amplifies fear of deviation. This is why controlling behavior often feels tense, even when it appears productive. At the omega level, that tension is immediately registered by the nervous system as misalignment. Reality mirrors that tension back as delays, friction, or unexpected obstacles. Not to punish you, but to signal that the approach no longer matches your state. Allowing is often misunderstood as passivity. In truth, allowing is precision. It requires clarity about what you are available for and what you are not. It means you stop interfering with natural movement by trying to dictate timing, form, or outcome. Allowing does not mean you do nothing. It means you do not override your internal signals in the name of control. You act when there is coherence. You pause when there is contraction. This creates flow. Flow is not ease without effort. It is effort without resistance. When you are aligned, actions feel timely rather than forced. Decisions feel simple rather than heavy. Movement happens without internal argument. This is not because life becomes predictable, but because your identity becomes stable. Identity is the signal reality responds to. Not your plans. Not your affirmations. Not your willpower. When identity is fragmented, control feels necessary. When identity is coherent, control feels intrusive. This is why surrender becomes essential at this phase. Surrender is not giving up agency. It is releasing the illusion that you can force alignment from the outside. True surrender is an internal agreement to stop fighting feedback. You listen. You adjust. You allow reality to meet you where you are instead of demanding it conform to where you think you should be. That agreement restores responsiveness to the system. As control collapses, you may notice discomfort. Control once provided a sense of safety, even if it was exhausting. Letting go can feel like stepping into uncertainty. But what you are actually stepping into is responsiveness. You begin to trust timing instead of pushing it. You begin to respect limits instead of overriding them. You begin to sense when action is required and when restraint is more powerful. Allowing also reveals where identity is still entangled with outcome. When you try to allow but feel anxious, it is often because part of you is still measuring your worth through results. Omega alignment requires disentangling self-concept from success or failure. You are not validated by outcomes. You are expressed through alignment. When that settles, allowing feels natural. The paradox is that as you release control, effectiveness increases. Not because you are doing less, but because you are no longer working against yourself. Energy that was spent managing fear is now available for presence. Presence sharpens perception. Perception improves timing. Timing reduces resistance. This is the sequence. Control collapses because it is no longer needed. Allowing begins because it is the only state that preserves coherence. And coherence is the condition it. Why responds to most faithfully. Creation does not happen in the future, and it is not corrected in the past. It only occurs now. This is not a philosophical statement. It is a functional one. The omega phase makes this unavoidable because identity coherence only exists in the present moment. The past is memory. The future is projection. Neither carries creative authority. Only the now does, because only the now contains your actual state. Earlier phases rely heavily on anticipation. You imagine outcomes, plan improvements, rehearse versions of yourself you hope to become. That orientation fragments attention. Part of you lives ahead of yourself, part of you lingers behind. Creation under those conditions is slow and unstable because the signal you are sending is inconsistent. In the omega phase, that fragmentation becomes uncomfortable. You feel pulled back into presence, not as a practice, but as a necessity. Timelines are not chosen through desire. They are selected through identity coherence in the present. Whatever state you consistently occupy now determines which trajectory becomes available. Calm presence is not neutral. It is authoritative. It signals internal agreement. When your emotional state, attention, and self-concept are aligned in the now, reality responds cleanly. When they are scattered across regret and expectation, reality mirrors that scatter. This is why calm becomes power at this stage. Not passivity, not indifference, but grounded presence. Calm indicates that your nervous system is no longer bracing against reality. It is receptive without being open-ended. That receptivity allows information, opportunity, and movement to meet you without resistance. Urgency disrupts this. Anxiety distorts timing. Nostalgia anchors you to expired identities. Calm presence keeps the signal current. The mind often resists this because it is conditioned to equate creation with effort. Doing feels productive. Waiting feels risky. But Omega creation does not respond to effort divorced from coherence. You can work tirelessly from a fragmented state and still produce delay. You can take minimal action from a coherent state and watch momentum build. This is not magic. It is resonance. Reality mirrors inner state, not words, not plans, not intentions. Being present does not mean disengaging from action. It means action arises from alignment rather than pressure. You act when the moment opens, not when fear demands movement. You pause when clarity is absent, not when external expectations push you forward. This sensitivity to timing is what makes Omega creation efficient. You are not forcing the current. You are moving with it. Identity coherence in the now also collapses the illusion of waiting. You are not waiting for permission, readiness, or signs. You are either aligned now or you are not. When alignment is present, creation is already happening, even if nothing visible has changed yet. When alignment is absent, no amount of planning will compensate. This simplifies everything. The question is no longer what should I do, but what state am I in while doing it? The present moment is not small. It is dense. It contains all possible trajectories, but only one can be selected at a time. That selection is automatic. It is based on who you are being now, not who you intend to be later. This is why the Omega phase pulls you out of mental time. You feel less interested in rehearsing futures or reprocessing the past. Your attention settles because it has finally found leverage. Calm presence is authority because it does not argue with reality. It listens, responds, and allows coherence to lead. From that state, creation is not something you chase. It is something that unfolds as a direct consequence of being exactly where you are, without resistance, without distraction, and without delay. Loneliness at this stage is not a flaw in your path. It is a function of it. You were never meant to fit seamlessly into existing structures because your role is not to blend, but to stabilize truth where distortion has become normal. When alignment deepens, belonging based on similarity stops satisfying. Resonance replaces it. And resonance is rarer. From early on, you may have noticed that fitting in required a version of you that felt slightly off. Not wrong, just diluted. You learned how to adapt, how to soften edges, how to translate yourself so others felt comfortable. That skill kept you connected, but it came at a cost. Authenticity was negotiated. In the Omega phase, that negotiation becomes impossible. Your system no longer tolerates self-betrayal, even in subtle forms. Non-belonging is not rejection. It is recalibration. As your internal state stabilizes, environments that once felt acceptable begin to feel incoherent. Conversations stay surface level. Communities revolve around repetition rather than truth. Shared language replaces shared presence. This is not arrogance. It is sensitivity to signal quality. You are no longer drawn to groups for identity reinforcement. You are drawn to spaces where coherence is already present or can be held without compromise. Authenticity becomes non-negotiable here, not as a moral stance, but as a biological one. Your nervous system reacts immediately when you perform. Fatigue increases. Tension builds. Silence feels safer than participation. This is feedback. Your system is informing you that resonance matters more than proximity. Fewer connections, but cleaner ones. Less interaction, but more integrity. Community, as it is commonly defined, often prioritizes agreement over alignment. It rewards sameness and smooths over discomfort. The omega phase does the opposite. It exposes inconsistency. Your presence alone may challenge group dynamics, not because you are confrontational, but because coherence reveals what is unexamined. This is why fitting in becomes difficult even in spiritual or growth-oriented spaces. You are not here to repeat shared beliefs. You are here to stabilize truth through presence. Resonance over community means connection happens differently. It is quieter. Less frequent. Often unplanned. You may recognize someone immediately without needing explanation. You may work alongside others without needing constant interaction. These connections do not seek to fill space. They support clarity. They allow silence. They do not require you to shrink or exaggerate yourself to remain welcome. Loneliness, then, is not emptiness. It is the space required for precision. When noise falls away, signal strengthens. When you stop forcing connection, alignment finds you. This phase teaches you to trust quality over quantity, depth over familiarity, and truth over comfort. You are not isolated because you are unworthy of connection. You are isolated because your frequency requires a different bandwidth. Eventually, you may notice that your presence stabilizes environments without effort. People speak more honestly around you. Conversations slow down. Assumptions surface. This is not something you do. It is something you allow by being internally consistent. You are not here to belong to the world as it is. You are here to hold a reference point for what it can become. Non-belonging is not a permanent condition. It is a transitional one. As resonance becomes your standard, connection reorganizes around it. Not in crowds, but in clarity. And that clarity is the ground truth you were meant to stabilize, not just for yourself, but for others who have not yet found the language to name it. Authority at the omega level does not come from position, volume, or dominance. It does not rely on convincing, persuading, or enforcing. It arises naturally from resonance. When your internal state is coherent, it establishes a reference point that other systems orient around without instruction. This is why omega authority often goes unnoticed by the ego. It does not look powerful. It feels inevitable. Most models of authority are built on control. Someone leads, others follow. Rules are enforced. Influence is exerted through leverage or hierarchy. That form of authority is necessary in fragmented systems, where coherence must be imposed externally. Omega authority functions differently. It does not impose order. It reveals it. Presence becomes the organizing principle. When you are internally aligned, environments respond. Conversations slow down. Tension dissipates or surfaces clearly. People either become more honest or more uncomfortable. Decisions crystallize without debate. This is not manipulation. It is coherence exposing incoherence. You are not doing anything to make this happen. You are simply not fragmenting yourself to accommodate distortion. Presence commands without force because it carries no agenda. Agenda creates pressure. Pressure invites resistance. Alignment creates openness. When you are aligned, you are not trying to extract anything from the environment. You are not seeking validation, compliance, or outcome. That lack of grasping removes friction. Others sense this immediately, even if they cannot articulate it. Systems respond to what is stable. This is why omega authority often feels quiet and understated. There is no need to assert it. Assertion would imply insecurity. True authority does not announce itself because it does not need reinforcement. It operates through consistency. Over time, people begin to reference you without realizing why. They adjust their behavior. They listen differently. Not because you demanded respect, but because coherence is persuasive on its own. Alignment is the highest authority because it cannot be argued with. You can debate opinions. You can resist commands. You cannot negotiate with resonance. When something feels internally exact, it carries weight. That weight is not emotional intensity. It is clarity. Clarity simplifies complexity. It removes excess. It brings things back to what actually matters. Systems respond to that simplification instinctively. This form of authority also requires restraint. When you realize your presence has impact, the temptation can arise to use it. Omega authority collapses the moment it is used for control. The moment you try to steer others for personal reasons, coherence fractures. Authority becomes performance again. The power of alignment depends on non-interference. You hold the signal. You do not weaponize it. You may notice that as this stabilizes, you speak less. Not because you have nothing to say, but because words are no longer required to establish direction. Silence becomes informative. Timing becomes precise. When you do speak, it lands differently. Not louder, but clearer. Not more convincing, but harder to ignore. This is not charisma. It is integrity. Authority without domination also means you do not need agreement. You do not argue with resistance. You allow misalignment to reveal itself. Some people will feel drawn. Others will feel unsettled. Both reactions are information. Neither requires correction. Your role is not to manage outcomes. It is to remain aligned. At this level, authority is not something you claim. It is something reality grants as a byproduct of coherence. You do not lead by pushing. You lead by standing still in truth. And from that stillness, environments reorganize, decisions clarify, and others find their own alignment without being told what to do. That is Omega authority. You do not trigger people because you are aggressive, superior, or intentionally disruptive. You trigger people because coherence exposes inconsistency. When your internal state stabilizes, it acts like a clear surface. Others see themselves reflected in it, often without warning. What they feel is not caused by you. It is revealed by you. Triggering is not an attack. It is exposure. When someone encounters coherence while still negotiating with their own misalignment, discomfort arises. That discomfort looks for a cause. The mind assigns it outward. You become the object, even though you are not the source. This is projection. Projection is not malicious. It is a nervous system attempting to protect its identity from destabilization. This is why reactions often feel disproportionate. A neutral statement provokes defensiveness. Silence is interpreted as judgment. Presence is read as threat. Nothing you did explains the intensity of the response because the intensity is not about the interaction. It is about what the interaction revealed. Coherence removes camouflage. It brings unexamined patterns to the surface. Some people experience that as relief. Others experience it as threat. Guilt often arises here, especially for those conditioned to maintain harmony. You may wonder if you should soften yourself, explain more, or adjust your tone to avoid triggering others. But adjusting coherence to manage someone else's discomfort is a form of self-distortion. It does not help them. It fragments you. The Omega phase requires a different response, neutrality without withdrawal. Calm boundaries are essential. Not walls, not defensiveness, but clarity. You do not need to correct projections. You do not need to justify your state. You do not need to absorb emotional reactions that do not belong to you. Boundaries at this level are energetic before they are verbal. You notice what is yours and what is not, and you do not cross that line internally. This does not mean you become indifferent. You can remain compassionate without taking responsibility for others' reactions. Compassion here is non-interference. You allow people to have their experience without making it about your worth or behavior. You do not argue with resistance. You do not chase understanding. You let coherence stand on its own. Personalizing resistance is tempting because it offers control. If it is your fault, you can fix it. If it is projection, you must let it be. That can feel uncomfortable, especially if you are used to managing relational dynamics. But letting projection pass without engagement is not avoidance. It is accuracy. You are respecting the process unfolding in the other person without entangling yourself in it. Over time, you may notice a pattern. Those who are ready feel calmer around you. Conversations deepen naturally. Honesty emerges. Those who are not ready feel irritated, defensive, or distant. Both responses are informative. Neither requires action. You are not here to be universally liked. You are here to remain aligned. This is where trust and coherence becomes critical. The moment you try to manage how others receive you, you dilute the very signal that creates clarity. Alignment does not negotiate. It reveals. Your responsibility is not to minimize impact, but to remain internally consistent. The field will sort the rest. When you stop personalizing resistance, triggering loses its emotional charge. It becomes data. You see clearly where alignment exists and where it does not. You conserve energy. You stay present. And in that presence, those who are meant to engage will find you without effort, while others will move away without conflict. That is not rejection. That is coherence. Doing its work. There comes a moment when knowing must turn into becoming. This is the shift into embodiment, where preparation ends and life itself becomes the practice. Until now, insight was gathered, patterns were understood, and coherence was stabilized internally. In the Omega phase, that internal state can no longer remain theoretical. It must be lived. Not performed, not announced, but expressed through how you move, choose, speak, and remain present. Embodiment begins when you stop waiting for confirmation. The mind often wants a signal that it is safe to proceed, a guarantee that the path will make sense before stepping onto it. Omega embodiment works in reverse. Movement reveals clarity. Action reveals alignment. You are not given a full map because a full map would keep you oriented toward control. What you are given instead is sensitivity. Intuition becomes the primary guide, not as impulse, but as quiet directional knowing that emerges when you are coherent. This is where preparation naturally dissolves. You may notice a loss of interest in endless refinement, planning, or self-improvement. That does not mean growth has stopped. It means growth has become integrated. You are no longer preparing to live. You are living in a way that continuously informs growth. Every interaction, every choice, every pause becomes feedback. There is no separation between learning and doing anymore. Living as a transmission does not mean teaching or leading overtly. It means your internal state is consistent enough that it carries information on its own. Your presence communicates clarity without explanation. Your boundaries teach without confrontation. Your pace sets rhythm without instruction. This is not influenced by effort. It is influenced by coherence. You are no longer trying to affect the field. You are allowing the field to respond to who you are. Moving without a full map requires trust, but not blind trust. It requires trust in feedback. You act, you feel the response, you adjust. Expansion indicates alignment. Contraction indicates correction. There is no failure here, only information. This responsiveness replaces rigid planning. You are not committing to outcomes. You are committing to alignment in each moment. That commitment keeps you oriented even when the path looks unfamiliar. At this stage, hesitation often comes from lingering attachment to certainty. The desire to know where this leads, who you will become, or how others will respond. Embodiment asks you to release those questions. Not because they are unimportant, but because they are premature. The Omega path reveals itself through participation, not prediction. You do not arrive as a finished version. You arrive as a living process. You may notice that action feels simpler now. Not easier, but clearer. Decisions require less deliberation. When something is aligned, you feel it. When it is not, you also feel it. This reduces noise. You stop second-guessing intuition and start respecting it. Over time, this builds confidence that is not based on success, but on internal consistency. You trust yourself because you are no longer abandoning yourself. Embodiment also removes the need to explain your path. Others may not understand your choices. Timelines may look unconventional. Progress may not be linear. None of that matters here. The measure is coherence, not appearance. You are not here to justify your movement. You are here to remain aligned as you move. When knowing becomes becoming, life stops feeling like a question. It becomes a response. You are no longer asking who you are meant to be. You are expressing it in real time, one decision, one pause, one intuitive step at a time. That is embodiment. And once it begins, it does not reverse. When coherence stabilizes, reality begins to reorganize without effort. Not dramatically, not all at once, but unmistakably. This is the subtle power of the Omega phase. You are no longer pushing against circumstances or trying to bend outcomes. Instead, life starts responding to you as if you have become a fixed reference point. Things align not because you asked, but because your internal state is consistent enough to be mirrored. This reorganization is often first noticed as magnetism. You stop chasing opportunities and notice that conversations, invitations, and openings arrive naturally. The right people appear at precise moments. Information reaches you when it is usable, not when it is overwhelming. This is not luck. It is coherence attracting what matches it. When your identity is stable, the field no longer receives mixed instructions. Response becomes efficient. Synchronicity increases for the same reason. Events line up without strain. Timing becomes accurate. You find yourself in the right place without planning it. You leave something just before it collapses. You arrive somewhere just as it opens. These moments are not rewards. They are indicators that resistance has dropped. When resistance drops, flow becomes visible. Subtle timeline shifts occur continuously at this stage. Not as dramatic leaps, but as gentle course corrections. A conversation you choose not to engage in prevents weeks of distraction. A pause you allow saves months of misalignment. A decision you make calmly redirects your trajectory without chaos. These shifts feel small in the moment, but they compound. Over time, you realize you are living a different life than the one you were unconsciously heading toward. Guarding attention becomes critical here. Attention is not neutral. It feeds timelines. What you dwell on, consume, or tolerate reinforces certain trajectories. In the Omega phase, this becomes immediately apparent. When you give attention to distortion, fatigue follows. When you give attention to coherence, energy stabilizes. This is not about avoidance. It is about stewardship. You begin to treat your attention as sacred because you can feel its impact. This is why subtle power replaces force. Forcing outcomes creates noise in the signal. Noise attracts correction. Subtlety preserves coherence. You act when alignment is present. You withdraw when it is not. You do not explain yourself unnecessarily. You do not push for resolution. You allow reality to meet you where you are instead of dragging it toward you. This restraint is not hesitation. It is precision. Reality reorganizing around coherence can feel anticlimactic. There is no dramatic moment where everything clicks into place. Instead, friction decreases. You feel less resistance moving through your days. Fewer things demand your energy. Fewer decisions feel heavy. You are not constantly fixing or managing. Life feels more responsive, as if it is cooperating rather than opposing. This does not mean challenges disappear. It means challenges arrive proportionate to your capacity. They inform rather than overwhelm. You meet them without collapsing because your identity is no longer fragmented. You are not scattered across outcomes. You are present. Presence absorbs impact. The most important shift is internal. You stop measuring progress by intensity or speed. You measure it by stability. You notice how quickly you return to center. How little you need to correct. How rarely you feel pulled off course. This is how timelines are rewritten, not through dramatic change, but through sustained coherence. The Omega phase teaches you that power does not announce itself. It stabilizes and lets the world reorganize naturally around it. When you stop trying to change reality and focus on remaining aligned, reality does the work for you. That is the subtle power. And once you experience it, force no longer makes sense. There is a final gate in the Omega phase that cannot be crossed halfway. It is not dramatic, but it is decisive. This is the moment when alignment stops being something you explore and becomes something you commit to living. The old life does not end because you reject it. It ends because it can no longer contain you. What closes here is not the past, but the habit of shrinking to survive within it. This decision is not made in excitement. It is made in clarity. You see, without negotiation, that returning to who you were would require self-betrayal. You may still feel attachment. You may still feel tenderness toward the life you lived, the people you loved, the versions of yourself that carried you this far. Grief belongs here. Not as regret, but as respect. You are honoring what was real without pretending it can continue unchanged. Liberation and grief arrive together at this gate. Liberation because you no longer have to explain, perform, or delay your truth. Grief because something familiar is dissolving, even if it was limiting. Both can coexist. One does not cancel the other. The Omega phase does not ask you to be fearless. It asks you to be honest. Honest about what no longer fits. Honest about the cost of staying misaligned. Choosing alignment over shrinking is not a grand declaration. It is a series of quiet refusals. You refuse to override your body's signals. You refuse to stay silent when silence distorts you. You refuse to maintain relationships that require you to abandon yourself. These refusals are not acts of aggression. They are acts of coherence. Each one seals the old life a little more firmly, not out of rejection, but out of inevitability. Once this decision is made internally, life reorganizes quickly. Not always comfortably, but clearly. You may feel moments of doubt, but they no longer derail you. You may feel fear, but it no longer dictates your choices. The internal argument ends. There is no longer a part of you trying to go back and a part trying to move forward. That split collapses. Direction becomes singular. This is what makes the commitment irreversible. Not because circumstances lock you in, but because your self-concept has shifted. You know what misalignment feels like now. You cannot unknow it. You cannot pretend comfort is worth the cost of fragmentation. Even if you wanted to, your system would not allow it. This is not rigidity. It is integration. The old life closes not with drama, but with quiet finality. You stop feeding it with attention. You stop negotiating with expired versions of yourself. You stop waiting for permission to live coherently. What opens next does not arrive all at once. It unfolds as you move, step by step, grounded in the decision you have already made. This is the Omega commitment. Not to perfection. Not to certainty. but to alignment without retreat. To presence without apology. To living as who you are, even when it costs you familiarity. Once this choice is made, you do not need to remind yourself of it. Your actions carry it forward naturally. The old life is complete. Subscribe and share this with someone who needs to hear it before their timeline closes.